Hugh Taft-Morales, and he will be speaking on Freethinkers, Faitheists, and Atheists, mapping non-believers.
Thank you, Rollin. Thank you, Jeffrey. Thank you, everybody, for coming. I want to say I'm particularly thankful that Jerry and Roseanne are here, my friends from New York, longtime friends, and my wife, Maureen. So, pressure is on today to produce. One of the problems with hanging out with all of you and lots of smart people is that you keep me thinking. So this talk today is still an evolution. You can tell by the amounts of paper marks on my notes. This thing is going to continue to evolve. And maybe bewilderedness is a good song for this talk, because I'm going to be covering a lot of ground. There was a handout, there may not be enough, but I can give you one if you want that has some of the overview, because what I want to offer is kind of a map of some of the free thought groups, the groups in the atheist and non-belief camp, etc. And they all are very different, and they all overlap, and they don't necessarily represent ethical humanism. Some of what they do does. So I'm not talking today about ethical humanism per se, but rather the sea that we float in. Because for me, ethical humanism, I believe that it has a few characteristics that are very, very important that aren't represented by some of these groups. For example, we are non-theist. In other words, we don't take a position on whether God exists or not. We are organizationally not an atheist organization, right? We do not deny that God exists. Given all this, however, since many people who want this sort of an event, weekly meetings, supporting each other through life, come here, if you were a theist, you'd probably go to a church or a mosque or a synagogue. So many of our members are atheists or agnostics, but not all. In addition, we're naturalistic, we're not supernaturalist. We believe in science and reason and evidence. And also, we focus most of all on how we live our lives, not on dogma or doctrine. I think that sets us apart from a lot of these other groups. That's what I believe we are. And that's the frame that I'm setting the rest of this talk in. I want to begin with a couple of events that happened in 2012 that set out ripples in the non-believer communities around the United States. The first is the Pew Research Center Forum on Religion and Public Life. It indicated a significant growth in the percentage of people in the United States who claim no religious affiliation. These are people who on questionnaires where they say, "What's your religion?" check the box, none. Okay? N-O-N-E. The Pew report led to many articles and commentaries about the rise of the nones. Got it? N-O-N-E-S, the rise of the nones. And that's in a nation that's still very, very religious. The Pew study indicated that 58% of Americans currently say religion is, quote, very important in their lives. Very different than Europe, for example, where in Spain 22% say that, Britain 17%, France 13%, compared to 58% here. The second event that caused many ripples was the Reason Rally down on the mall between the Capitol and the Washington Monument in the March of 2012. This was known as a national coming out party for freethinkers, atheists, and humanists, and it was a great success from many perspectives. I wrote about it in the May 2012 Ethical Society newsletter that you can get online by going to our website. I enjoyed the music and the humor and the speeches and the energy that was palpable there. I hadn't felt that kind of energy since the first inaugural address when President Obama mentioned the word non-believer in his talk. Unheard of. Now, as an aside, a few months after the Reason Rally, I was disappointed when in his second inaugural, he did not mention non-believer or atheist or humanist or freethinker. Yet he did speak of a gift from God, the eyes of God, his oath to God, the planet being given to our care by God. And he concluded with the phrase, "The planet, God bless you, and may he forever bless these United States of America." Now, at least he could have used the female pronoun there. He would have won a little bit, right? But this reminded me that in U.S. politics, non-believers are still marginalized. So at the Reason Rally, when Fred Edwards, who used to be the director of the American Humanist Association, yelled out, "We're here, we're godless, gets used to it," I liked that. It felt good. I particularly liked the name of the Reason Rally. The Reason Rally. The many diverse sponsors of that event all appreciate that fundamental in building both collective wisdom and constructing social policy is reason. All those groups that sponsored it had little tolerance for superstition or irrationality or bigotry. They defended freedom of conscience, separation of church and state, science, open access to information. All good things. As an ethical humanist leader, however, there were times at the rally that I felt a little bit like an outsider. How many people were there? A few. Okay. When the speakers warned of the dangers of religious fundamentalism, I cheered along. When they made fun of some of the sillier aspects of religion, I was okay with that personally. But when they began with a big brush to mock, in a caustic manner, religious people, I got silent because I felt uncomfortable. I began to think a lot about where I fit into this godless rainbow coalition, both personally and professionally, as an ethical culture leader. I'm not drawn to be a firebrand atheist activist because, well, for me at least, a radical atheist is somebody who's concerned more about proving the non-existence of God than in making the world a better place. And that doesn't work for me. Granted, many radical atheists think those two go hand in hand. And I think that is important for them to say, stand up to, and argue for. They believe their anti-theism is a form of humanitarianism. So I'm not ruling that out. But I currently defend the right of religious believers to proclaim their faith in the same way that I defend the rights of atheists to disclaim their disbelief. Now, for that, I would be pilloried by many radical atheists, as has been Chris Stedman. He's been attacked. He's the author of a book called Faitheists, How an Atheist Found Common Ground with the Religious. I'm going to leave some of these up here. You can look at them afterwards. He is an interesting individual. I talked to him on the phone a couple of weeks ago, and we discussed how quite often there's a tendency of anti-authoritarian groups to get involved in infighting with each other. And you can see this in history and culture quite often. One of my favorite movies is Monty Python's The Life of Brian. Now, in that film, the hero, the deified and then soon to be crucified Brian, wants to join the rebels to fight the Romans. But he encounters something typical of rebels, this self-destructive habit of splintering into many competing factions. So for Brian, he's confronted with infighting between the People's Front of Judea, the Judean People's Front, and the Judean Popular People's Front. And that consists of one lonely guy. A couple of years ago, New York Times columnist Jonathan Chait said that Monty Python got it right. Psychologists, he talked about, noted a left-wing tendency for everybody to basically express yourself, and a right-wing tendency to be a team player. So the left, I think, is more open to this. I mean, you can see many socialists and communists and anarchist cells, each with their own agenda and their own T-shirt. You can recall the 1968 Democratic Convention, the demonstrations before those. Dave Barry, the columnist, talked about that. He said it consisted of spokespersons for about 253 major ideological factions, each giving each other the finger through clouds of tear gas. You can also note the splintering of the Occupy movement that has been unable to recapture that unity that really at one point felt like they were leading us to a revolution against the 1%. So this challenge confronts also this loose coalition of thinkers with many labels: atheists, agnostics, secularists, freethinkers, skeptics, non-believers, humanists of all stripes. Ethical humanists, secular humanists, religious humanists. So before I discuss a little bit more of the rise of the nones, I want to offer a brief overview of this humanist spectrum. So this map, I'm going to talk about categories, and these categories overlap and they blur. They're not perfect. First, I'm going to sort out some of the general humanist groupings, and I gained a lot of wisdom from Corliss Lamont's The Philosophy of Humanism and Fred Edwards, who's a great historian as well. All these groups I'm going to talk about have different sort of historical roots and shadings. For example, Renaissance humanism. That's the historic revival of Greek and Roman thought, emphasizing humans' ability to determine truth, and that occurred at the end of the Middle Ages. It was, in Corliss Lamont's words, a revolt against the otherworldliness of medieval Christianity. and it's well represented in the writings of Erasmus or the art of Michelangelo, bringing philosophy down to earth, to human terms. That's part of a broad Western cultural humanism that grew out of the Renaissance, and that incorporated the rational and empirical traditions dominating contemporary science and political theory and ethics and law, emphasizing evidence. There's also a category called literary humanism, which tends to sometimes criticize science for being a little bit too rationalistic, but does embrace the rest of humanist agenda, like the humanist responsibility for our lives and the planet. There's a philosophical humanism that centers on human needs. Jeffrey talked about it at dinner last night, about how it includes Immanuel Kant and his belief that everybody should be treated as an end in themselves, never as a means. Everybody's worthy of respect just for being human. There's also naturalistic humanism, and this is a very large category. It rejects supernaturalism. It relies on reason and science and democracy and human compassion. And it claims a lot of people, including William James, John Dewey, Marie Curie, Julian Huxley, Albert Einstein, Sigmund Freud, Jean-Paul Sartre, Walter Lippmann, Archibald MacLeish, all over the place. But within naturalistic humanism is an important distinction between its religious and its secular forms. All naturalistic humanism rejects ideas related to the God concept. Ideas including an all-powerful divine being, or heaven, or reincarnation, or miracles. But some naturalistic humanists like the congregational aspects of religion, or the experiences of awe and wonder and humility that's found in a lot of religions, or both. Sometimes they're called religious humanists. Now, Unitarian ministers like John Dietrich and Curtis Reese and Charles Francis Potter are central to religious humanism in the United States. They changed the religious landscape in America in the early 1800s. They liberalized it. They helped create what eventually became the first Humanist Manifesto at the beginning of the 1900s in 1933. And this manifesto is not meant to be dogma, just an expression of, quote, a quest for values and goals. It criticized, for example, our overly profit-dominated society as being incapable of providing for human needs. There was a Humanist Manifesto 2 in 73, and it embraced the terms non-theism and even spiritual. But that latter term, they said, spiritual meant only if it was meant to mean the cultivation of moral devotion and the creative imagination. So it used the term spiritual without implying supernatural. It's imagination and devotion to moral causes. It also talked about caring for the marginalized. And then the most recent Humanist Manifesto was in 2000, and it really brought in a lot of environmentalism and our place in the web of life. So ethical culture, though, was flourishing a generation really before Dietrich and the Potter as an alternative to traditional religion. And it's labeled as religious humanism by some people, not all. Interestingly, its founder, Felix Adler, didn't like the term humanism because it thought it was a little bit too species-centric, which is interesting. He thought it glorified us too much and that we'd be guilty of hubris using the term. He was not drawn to human beings as we are, but human beings who we could become through getting closer to our ideals. And I love that, but some of it was full of a little bit of philosophical idealism that was a little harder to take. So when he died in 1933, we began to drift a little bit away from philosophical idealism and more towards humanism, in ethical humanism. It maintained the religious format in the sense that we meet in a congregational setting. We basically get together fairly regularly and help each other through the ups and downs of life. That's what I mean by a congregational setting. That's how the courts saw ethical humanism about 50 years ago. So here's the 20-second legal explanation. Cases in 1957 and 1961 ruled that ethical societies were religious institutions based on our functional definition of religion. It was a quack like a duck ruling. They said, well, look at ethical societies, like a church. The Washington Ethical Society, which was the plaintiff in the case, engaged in weekly meetings, had Sunday schools, seasonal celebrations, marriages, funerals, community service projects, and all these took place like in churches or mosques and synagogues in a congregational setting where people meet regularly. So the Supreme Court reasoned that the Washington Ethical Society acted like a religion, and the court could not deny it religious grounds based on doctrine. So that's where that came from. But surely some humanists, ethical and otherwise, don't feel comfortable with the term religious as part of the term religious humanism. And that's why in the last copy of Free Inquiry magazine, there's some Xeroxes of some articles, you're welcome to take the Xeroxes. Greg Epstein, who's the humanist chaplain up at Harvard, along with James Croft, who's an ethical culture leader in training, a neat guy, recommended that we start using the term congregational humanism to avoid the term religious. They thought that that would basically better describe places like ethical culture, where some people might think religious means God concept. So maybe that will catch on, I don't know. But I want to turn a little bit to the term secular humanism now. What does that mean? Unitarian Universalist minister Bill Murray describes it by comparing it to religious humanism, or congregational humanism. He says, quote, "Religious humanism emphasizes the importance of communities that affirm, support, and encourage these values through preaching, teaching, caring for one another, and deliberating life and life's passages together. Secular humanism does not." That may change, but currently that works pretty well. And secular humanism was a term that has really been a big part of debate over the last 80 years. It's often used negatively. Back in 1943, the Archbishop of Canterbury, William Temple, said that, quote, "Christian tradition was in danger of being undermined by secular humanism, which hoped to retain Christian values without Christian faith." So that was the threat. In 1961, Supreme Court Justice Hugo Black confused things a bit because he wrote that, quote, "Among religions in this country which do not teach what we would generally be considered a belief in the existence of God are Buddhism, Taoism, ethical culture, secular humanism, and others." Now, that was a mistake. It's precisely what many fundamentalists wanted people to believe about secular humanism. So listen to this wrinkle. This is interesting. They wanted to weaken secular humanism as some sort of common ground for civic life. Because the fundamentalists reasoned that if secular humanism could be defined as a religion and pushed to the religious side of this church-state divide, secular humanism would not be able to claim that this is the meeting place for everybody, religious or otherwise. That they'd have to be excluded from the civic sphere. This happened again in the rise of the 80s. If you Google secular humanism, many times you'll see a lot of the conservative forces in the 80s and 90s coming out slamming secular humanism as the cause of all evil. Ed Dorr, in an article in the Humanist magazine, said that secular humanism was, quote, "demonized by the religious right." Okay? Now, lots of commentators have talked about the fact that the right is much better at framing issues than the left. They sort of they define the terms and they get the words out there. So I think that today, with the rise of the nones, where people are beginning to search and think about where they want to be, I think all humanists have to do a much better job of defining who they are and be more professional in their outreach and marketing as well. So I want to turn to this humanist spectrum, but focus a little bit more on some concrete organizations. Besides ethical culture, which was established as a small but evolving humanist movement loosely federated under the American Ethical Union, that's our federating society, I'm going to mention a whole bunch of other groups, skeptic, rationalist, and free thought, and I'll do it in alphabetical order so I don't show preference. And as I said, there's a handout available. I'm not going to describe all of them, but I just want to give you a sense of what these groups are. I'll start with American Atheists, who, according to their website, has fought to protect the absolute separation of religion from government and to raise the profile of atheism in public discourse since 1963. Its uncompromising advocacy of atheism, combined with its very media-savvy and determined president David Silverman, attracts a lot of press. The American Humanist Association was founded in 1941, and it defends constitutional rights of all, including non-believers. It lobbies Congress. It's mainly an advocacy group. Recently, they've been trying to build communities, like the humanist community up at Harvard. They've worked with them. Royce Beckert, who's their executive director, has been involved with ethical culture a lot in joint projects. The Center for Inquiry was established in 1991 by Paul Kurtz to foster a secular society based on science and reason and freedom of inquiry and humanist values. One of its affiliates, the Council for Secular Humanism, publishes Free Inquiry magazine, the one I held up before, and it tries to meet the needs of people who are looking for meaning without looking to God. The Foundation Beyond Belief was created by Dale McGowan. He wrote the book called Parenting Beyond Belief, and they focus on giving charity, time, and money to good causes, but from sort of a humanist perspective. The Free Thought Society, many of you know, run by the amazing Margaret Downey, has a mission similar to American Atheists, except they advocate for a broader range, not just atheists, but all non-believers and freethinkers, to raise awareness about the free thought community. This humanist community at Harvard, headed by Greg Epstein and Chris Stedman, the author of the book Faitheists, strives to make humanism recognized, accessible, and influential across the United States, and as I said, are trying to build up communities that would serve what we serve here, getting a group of people together to support each other. The Humanist Institute, where I graduated from a number of years ago, it basically educates future humanist leaders to become good advocates and spokespersons. The Association of Unitarian Universalist Humanists, which are known as HU Humanists. They're changing the name because it's difficult to market. But seriously, but it's trying to advance UU circles, humanism, and to promote religious humanism in general. They produce a magazine. The Institute. The next one, the Institute for Humanist Studies. This is a think tank that focuses on political and economic matters. It's headed by Tony Pinn, and it gathers information about sort of governmental and economic things. They also support a secular summer camp called Camp Quest. The International Humanist and Ethical Union, which the AEU is a member, was founded in 1952, and it's the sole global umbrella for all humanist, skeptic, and secular groups. And the American Ethical Union is also a member of the Secular Coalition for America. They're a lobbying group down in D.C. that lobbies for the rights of all non-believers and atheists. And they have hosted us this past summer for a lobby day down on Capitol Hill, where we lobbied for science education and other humanist causes. One of the fastest growing groups is the Secular Student Alliance, which helps student groups on campuses get together and form communities that focus on critical inquiry and democracy and secularism. There's a Society for Humanistic Judaism that focuses on human-centered philosophy of life within the cultural heritage and identity of Judaism. And finally, the United Coalition of Reason helps bring together local free thought, atheist, agnostic, and humanist groups so that they can have a bigger impact in local environments. And both the Philadelphia Society and the Baltimore Ethical Society, where I work, we're members of our local United Coalition of Reason as well. So I apologize for this list, but I hope you learn more about these organizations, not only so you're more able to talk about them, but so you can be drawn to organizations that feed your humanism and add to a collaboration between these groups. All of these groups want to go out and advertise themselves to the nones, okay? And how well they do that is going to be dependent on the clarity of their mission, the quality of their programs, the warmth of their community. But it's also going to be dependent on how well they understand the nones, the people who are religiously unaffiliated. So I want to turn to that for a second. Now, the Pew study in 2012 referred to the nones, as I said, as those who mark on a survey no religious affiliation or preference. Now, the report itself acknowledges that that can be misleading because it's a negative definition. Scott and I were talking about how negative definitions, non-believer, don't really tell you what you do believe. For example, some might conclude that only those affiliated with formal groups can be religious. But clearly that's not true. Some people are religious with no affiliation to an organization. They pray before a meal, or they commune in nature, whatever. So that's a problem. Another problem is, in the wording of categories, is that the study spoke of, quote, the religiously unaffiliated as our preferred term for Americans who tell us in surveys that they are atheists, agnostics, or have no particular religion. But that wording implies that you can't have a religious affiliation if you're an atheist. And that's not true. Talk to any atheist UU or Buddhist or Taoist or ethical culturist, right? Nevertheless, the Pew Studies does offer us an interesting window into this group of people who do not consider themselves religiously affiliated. They give some theories about why this group is growing. One theory is that there's basically just broad social disengagement, that people are less and less drawn towards being part of a community. Some describe this as this tendency towards a more isolated existence with fewer group activities. It ties into the bowling alone theory, the book by Robert Putnam, that we're all just becoming more isolated. A second theory is that the rise of the nuns is a political backlash against the conservative religious fundamentalism, which is possible, and that might speak to groups that are advocating for separation of church and state. It might draw some of the nuns to that, and it might draw nuns that are involved in progressive political efforts. This third theory I think is really interesting. It claims that the rise of the nuns is due to the rise of economic well-being. Now, despite the fact that we've had economic downturns, decade after decade, people are getting a little bit more secure economically, maybe not till real recently, but some studies do show a strong correlation between economic development and secularization. I think you can see some of that in the Middle East now. But before humanist groups get too excited about the rise of the nuns, it's important to realize that the nuns are not some homogeneous groups of rationalists just yearning for a humanist home. They're very, very diverse, and this is interesting. Most of the nuns say they believe in God. Most describe themselves as religious or spiritual or both. In addition, most of the nuns think that religion can be a force for good in society. They cite religions as creators of community bonds and good sources for aid to the needy. So I wonder, does that favor religious humanism? But the Pew Report also indicates what I said before, that most of the nuns are, quote, not looking for a religion that would be right for them. Overwhelmingly, the nuns think that religions are too concerned with money and power, too focused on rules, and too involved in politics. Even secular humanist communities are going to have a hard time drawing the nuns because they believe, they say that they are, quote, much less important, it's much less important to belong to a community of people with shared values and beliefs. So they're very diverse, and maybe they just are much more unaffiliated. They just want more autonomy. Now, that, interestingly enough, would please the head of the Center for Inquiry, Tom Flynn, in an article in Free Inquiry. He talks about the fact that he hopes that all of the young people that leave fundamentalist churches don't get sucked into liberal congregations, because he says that, quote, community can imprison as well as sustain. He said he'd rather have all these nuns stand up on their own and not be, quote, victimized by infantilizing institutions and the authoritarian trappings of congregational life. So there's this real emphasis on beware of the group, beware of the cult, right? Anybody drink the Kool-Aid today? It seems to him that religious humanism is just one more dead end that blocks individualism and autonomy. And if the data's right, some of the nuns probably agree. Well, it's my job to prove both Tom Flynn wrong and to educate the nuns about what ethical humanism, for example, can offer. That you don't lose your individualism within ethical humanism, and that you gain a community. That you can be who you are, but you can benefit from naturalistic inspiration if you want it, or community life if you want it. Right here in Philadelphia and other cities around the country. We offer a community where believers can try to live closer to their ideals, supported by one another through the ups and downs of life. Now, here also, some people consider their affiliation religious, and others do not. Both are fine, okay, absolutely. That's part of our free thought tradition. And I want to retain that dual nature of us, because that dual nature says whether you consider this a secular or religious connection, what matters most is how you live your life. Now, managing that, just including the word religion as an option, can be difficult. Witness how many people heard or saw the interview with Diana Nyad, the swimmer, on Oprah Winfrey. Very interesting moment. After successfully swimming from Cuba to Florida, Diana Nyad was denied her own identity on Oprah's because she talked about her awe and wonder for the naturalistic world, but said she was an atheist. And Oprah, who should know better, redefined Nyad's experience as actually one being in connection with God of some force. Nyad persisted. She said, these are Nyad's words, "I think you can be an atheist who doesn't believe in an overarching being who created all of these things, but there's a spirituality because we human beings and we animals, and maybe even we plants, and certainly the ocean and the moons and the stars, we all live with something that is cherished, and we feel the treasure of it." Now, not all humanists talk that way, but there is a lot more room within humanists for people to speak out like that, to speak out about authentic experiences, previously reserved to religion, awe, wonder, humility, connection to something greater. And you can see it in books that are coming out now. A number of them we've talked about in our summer programs, like Alain de Botton's Religion for Atheists, Robert Solomon's Spirituality for the Skeptic, Andre Comte-Spoonville's Little Book of Atheist Spirituality. They all open up a wider area for discussion within humanism. And an important part about humanists being taken seriously is that we understand what we're about and we can talk about it with radical atheists and with the traditionally religious. So it brings me back to Chris Stedman's book, Faitheists. Now, Chris first heard the term Faitheists when he was attending an atheist cocktail party, that's what he called it, and somebody hurled it at him as a derogatory epitaph. They implied that Chris, who really wanted to sort of stay friendly with the religious, was not a real atheist. Or that he even secretly wanted to be religious. Ethical culture leaders discussed this book last month at our leaders meeting, and before that discussion, I talked to Chris about his anguished journey coming out as gay in a fundamentalist Christian community. And he talks in the book about how much that taught him about the perils of labeling and marginalization and speaking past each other. Lessons that he remembered as he became an atheist activist. He talked to me about how these attitudes of marriage equality, anybody who knows the number one factor indicating why states began to favor marriage equality, it was personal relationships with gays and lesbians. Conversations with actual people, one-on-one. That was made the biggest difference in turning the tide. Listening deeply, responding caringly. So once Chris began his interfaith work, he brought that out, saying that speaking one-on-one with religious people, he found was the best way for them to begin taking his humanism seriously. Because before those conversations, they thought of him as just another crazy atheist ready to destroy religion. And afterwards, they found mutual respect in both ways. So it's going to benefit everybody, ourselves, and both sides of the belief and non-belief spectrum, to be able to explain ethical humanism, to communicate between theists and non-theists, between religious humanists and secular humanists. So our goal in speaking, for example, with these other groups, is not to try to convince them of our naturalistic humanism, but to create a relationship first. That comes first. Because only after that do people really listen to each other, when there's trust. We want them to understand our commitment to D before creed. We want them to understand what we mean by supporting naturalism. But we also want to tell them that we care more about feeding starving children and ending war than proving ourselves right. And many of them agree with that as well. But in the middle of culture wars, it's hard to do that. It's very hard. So regardless of how hard we try to explain ourselves, often people of traditional faith are going to see us as hostile atheists. And the only way to really get beyond that is engaging with them. Now, Stedman says for him, interfaith work is not just talking to each other, and it's not just meeting at a soup kitchen together. It's both. Finding common work where you can agree, working together, and at the same time discussing your differences. Because you don't want to paper over the differences, but you want to put them in the perspective of a relationship that is caring and in work that matters to both of you. So that for him is what interfaith work is, and that's what I hope we do more of. We need to turn the corner from treating other groups as theological competitors to being ethical allies. That's the turn we need to take. So, as I get to my conclusion, I want to just apply a little bit of Chris Stedman's wisdom to the question of how we work with these other humanist groups and how we reach out to the nones. Working collaboratively with atheists, agnostics, freethinkers, and skeptics, I think we can have this shared dialogue and service project with other humanist groups, both religious and secular. We have feet in both camps, and I think for that reason we have a particularly important place in helping the humanist community come together around shared values. So I'm just going to point to one that many of you who are members here know well about, our collaboration with the Free Thought Society. Now, we've done a lot with them recently. First thing we did was we co-sponsored a talk right here with Lawrence Krauss, who wrote the book, A Universe from Nothing. And that brought 200 people, who many of them for the first time heard about ethical humanism and the Free Thought Society, brought them together. We did things like had discussions with Jay Wexler about church-state divides, or uncovering the Good News Club with Catherine Stewart. Personally, I enjoyed most of all hosting Roy Zimmerman, who I think is the best humanist, progressive singer-songwriter of political parodies and religious intolerance. So when he comes back, come and see him. You will not be disappointed. Margaret has these contacts. We have the great space, and together we have great programs. She also has a tree of knowledge. Many of you may not know about this. Her space at the Westchester County Courthouse was taken away. And so she came here with her tree. We have a nice place for a 14-foot tree in our lobby. We hang laminated copies of our favorite free thought books on the tree to represent the importance of knowledge around the holiday season. Margaret's encouraging all of you, members of the Ethical Society, to bring your own covers so that the tree begins to evolve to be a closer combination of the values of the free thought tradition and ethical humanism. So I urge you to do that. We got radio coverage on NPR. We got a local article in the paper. We got more people coming, and we had some fun. So these forms of collaboration also can work with the Philadelphia Coalition of Reason. We have a picnic every July, a unity picnic. We have Human Light celebration that people can go to. We should work with all of these groups in the humanist spectrum where we agree. And these shared celebrations are not meant to paper over the differences. But in working together where we agree, it brings out our best and lets the differences become opportunities for education and not threats to survival. As we gain confidence in speaking across difference with respect, I think we're going to grow stronger, and we might find that ethical humanism is best served. So I hope this little map of free thought and humanist groups help you grow more connected to your values and helps get you out into that humanist sea, reading more of the journals. It may deepen your faith in ethical humanism, and should that happen, some of the nones at least might start taking us more seriously. Thanks very much.